Clayton White is a native of Afton, Wyoming, and after a stint in the U.S. Army earned a baccalaureate degree in zoology at the University of Utah. He completed graduate work at the University of Alaska and earned a PhD in zoology from the University of Utah in 1968. He has taught at the University of Kansas and at Cornell University before coming to BYU in 1970. His professional accomplishments are very impressive. Among many, he has directed the Ornithological Assessment Program for the U.S. Atomic Energy Commission at the Aleutian Island Underground Testing Program. He has served as project leader for the survey on Alaskan raptors for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and he has been retained as a consultant on bald eagles for the Pitson Oil Company. He has also appeared as an expert witness on raptors for the Exxon Oil Company during the Exxon Valdez oil spill inquiry. Professor White is a member of a number of distinguished professional associations, including the American Ornithologists Union, the Raptor Research Foundation, the Cooper Ornithological Society, the Wilson Ornithological Society, and Sigma Chi. He has published over 160 articles, mostly on predatory birds, and has authored or co-authored 22 chapters in a variety of books. In 1996, BYU recognized Professor White's significant contribution to scholarship and learning here at BYU by awarding him the prestigious Carl G. Mazur Research Award. We are delighted and honored today to have Professor White with us to share his affection for and study of peregrine falcons. Professor White.
Well, I hope that you learn as much about them today as I plan on. And this is not a single effort of mine. I must recognize my wife and my family who put up with the nonsense of the 42 years of marriage we've had and my being gone a lot. I recognize my graduate students. Without their help, I couldn't do a lot of things. I recognize the faculty and administration at Brigham Young University who've allowed me to go places and have faculty who have sat in and taken over my lectures when I was gone. I might say that this is sort of a takeoff on a talk I was asked to give for the Tanner Lecture several months ago in the Bean Museum. And I take my title from a book that a colleague of mine has written. It's called Parts Unknown, and I use that because, and that title comes from, by the way, from a book written in 1935 by Peter Freuchen. He wrote a book called Arctic Adventures, My Life in the Frozen North, and much of it was about Greenland. And as Freuchen was in southern Greenland, he looked at a map to go to northern Greenland. And the maps in those days usually had a big bold thing that said Parts Unknown, and sometimes it showed an Eskimo there, Inuit, with a harpoon or whatever. And so as he left he writes in his book, as he left from Kayterkok, we sailed off to Parts Unknown. And I'd like to suggest to you that some of the places that we're going to go today are parts unknown, not to the people that live there, because they are intimately known, but to those of us from Western society that have done much of the exploration of the world, and those of us sitting in this room who may never have a chance to go to those places. They really are, in fact, parts unknown. And I looked at a map in the library to try to find one that showed this parts unknown, and I couldn't find one. I found a Greenland map of 1888, but didn't show it. But I did find another one. Now let's see if I touch this. Yep, okay. So now 35 millimeter, power on. I did find another one that I want to show you. That is, there's a map of Alaska. This was from a 1936 atlas. So this was made the year I was born. This is 66 years old. And you can see this major river right here. They show that river coming down and bending and coming back in this way here. And that's not the way that river goes. That's the most important river on the Arctic slope of Alaska that drains all of Alaska. That river actually runs down here. It runs all the way around here and comes back around there. And so even in 1936, the map makers were not getting things accurately as recently as that. This is sort of the area we're going to talk about. These are the places that we have gone looking for peregrine falcons, but I'm going to sort of zero that down to just a couple of case examples. Here's Provo, Utah. We're going to talk a bit about Greenland, then something about Alaska, and then move to the southern hemisphere, Australia, Fiji, and Vanuatu, and talk about what takes place there. The peregrine has a worldwide distribution. Other than humans, it has the widest distribution of any warm-blooded vertebrate on the planet. This map is not accurate. This map, there's plenty of places where it should go. It should be in here. It should go a bit higher there. It should go a bit more there. There's several places that map really isn't accurate, especially here in this region. But that gives you sort of a feeling for where peregrines are. And because they are so widespread, they show an enormous variation. Take a look around, if you will, at the people that you know, at humans. You'll see the same sort of variation. You'll see people that have different configurations and different skin colors. And reasons for those are probably adaptive, the same as they are with peregrines. From very pale ones like you see here to kind of brown ones, very dark ones. And so as they go around the world, they show an enormous amount of variation. Let me just tell you a little bit about them before we get into the other slides. One of the interesting things about them that has aided in the study of them is their enormous fidelity to their breeding sites. We call this philopatry. It's the same kind of thing that many of you students will have. Those that are here from California will get your degrees and you return to California or you return to New York, wherever you're from, because of this drive of philopatry. And peregrines do the same thing. So their nesting sites are used year after year after year after year by generations and generations. And in fact, one of my colleagues in Australia went to a nesting site that had a big overhang on it, so that the nesting site was actually back very sheltered. And the fecal material, the excretory material, builds up, and the pile was about that high in the site. And so he took a slice through it, and he radiocarbon dated the bottom part of that. That stuff was 16,000 years old, so they had been using that site for 16,000 years at a minimum. Well, this tells you something about this fidelity. This is one of the really hallmarks of their biology. They had an early history with humans. The early people of the time of Genghis Khan, for example, used them to hunt and get food for the hordes that he had. The early British used them in the art of falconry. They were companions with them. When you get up to the 11th century or the 1100s, Shakespeare himself wrote about them. Shakespeare is 1600, isn't he? For example, he wrote, "Oh, for a falconer's voice, to lure this tassel gentle back again." Tassel was the word they used for the male. That's from Romeo and Juliet, Act 2, Scene 2. Or if you go to Much Ado About Nothing, Act 3, Scene 1, he says, "I know her spirits are as coy and wild as haggards of the rock." Haggards were the name that they used for adult peregrines. Julius Caesar talked about them. Shakespeare talked about them. A lot of people have really sort of put them in the limelight. Well, then enter the 1800s and the early 1900s. People viewed them as vermin. The whole story was turned right around, and they began to persecute them. There was a bounty put on them. During World War II, as the French sent messages by pigeons across the English Channel, peregrines in England would kill those, and they never got the messages. And so a bounty was put on the peregrine, and they reduced the population in the United Kingdom by about 30% of its original population. Following the war, they stopped persecuting them. They bounced back very quickly, as most wild populations will. And then the pesticide era hit them, and they took another decline. And that's the point at which they became sort of a cause célèbre of the environmental movement and became a very high-profile species. And here's what happened. Here you can see an eggshell that has been cut in the cross-section. This is an electron microscope view of that, and you can see how thick that shell is. and you can look at some of the architecture of that shell. The pesticides entered the picture following World War II, about 1948. By 1964, this is how thick they were. They had lost about 15% or 18% of their thickness, and now by 1969, you can see how thin they were. The architecture changed. That caused many things to happen. One thing was the breaking of eggs when the young were not yet fully grown, or the loss of water through these shells because of the architecture, and so young died in the shells. And as a result of that, the peregrine falcon throughout most of Western Europe and North America was listed as endangered in 1972. It's now been taken off of that list. But a lot of people ask, why do you study peregrines? And I guess I can only ask, why not? There's anything to study. They're wonderful. They're marvelous. They have a wonderful biology. They're charismatic in some ways. And I've really enjoyed it. So what I'm going to do today is take you on a little trip. I'm going to go to Greenland first, where we had, I went up with one of my graduate students, and his student now is going, his son is now studying in Greenland, so there have been these sort of 3 academic generations there. And one of the things that I did was to go out and look at Thule, which is the northmost human population, at the ice shelf, or where the fast ice was, during the Cold War, and most of you kids here really don't appreciate the Cold War, but during that time period, a B-52 bomber came in to land at the air base at Thule and missed the air base and lit on the ice. It had a nuclear warhead, an armed nuclear warhead in it, and part of the material sunk to the bottom of the bay. And what we wanted to know was, is that material still there? Are seabirds feeding there? And are the peregrines feeding on those seabirds? Because those peregrines migrate all the way to South America. And so the question that I had was, is there some of this intercontinental contamination? So we'll talk just briefly about that. Talk a little bit about the Aleutian Islands. Starting in 1969, the U.S. military had a program which was called the Spartan Missile. Now, when you stop and think about this, you often ask yourself, well, why would they do what they wanted to do? But the idea was to put this missile into the atmosphere. It would explode and put out a belt of radiation, with the idea that incoming missiles from the enemy, you see, would hit that belt of radiation and lose their guidance systems. No one asked them the question, well, what are you going to do with that belt after this is all over? So anyway, they tested this in the Aleutian Islands, dug holes down about 6,000 feet and set off 3 different devices to find out what kind of yields they would have. And then we'll take you over to the western margin of the Alaska National Wildlife Refuge and the Alaska Pipeline and look at a few things there. After we leave that, we'll go to the southern hemisphere and look at 3 places. Australia briefly, where me and 3 of my graduate students were asked to come down and survey the populations and find out what their pesticide loads were and get a baseline from which the Australians could work, and we worked in the state of Victoria. And then we'll go to the island of Fiji in the Pacific, which is the sort of easternmost distribution of the species, and then into Vanuatu, where the peregrine also occurs, a very primitive country, and try to contrast those 2 areas. Now, the reason these 2 areas for me, these northern and southern, are interesting is because peregrines are adapted to hunt in open landscapes. So in the tropics, they have a disadvantage. They have to hunt over forests. They have to find things that go above the canopy. And this puts them at a disadvantage. Therefore, they have to have very, very large hunting ranges. Therefore, the population on the ground is very sparse, very low. And there's nothing like you would find in the Arctic, where you have every mile or so along a river you'll find a peregrine falcon. So that's what I hope to do. In the southern hemisphere, it's been interesting to work in those 2 countries because in the country of Fiji, they have a united language. All Fijians speak the same language. The word for peregrine there is nanivatu. And so you can go to an island and you can say, well, do you have nanivatu here? And they, oh yes, you see, because there's a rich folklore surrounding this bird. During the time that the Europeans began to settle Fiji and missionaries got there, they tried to, quote, conquer the Fijians. And what the folklore tells them is that their chief climbed up into a cave on a high mountain above the village of Namosi and turned into a Nanivatu, into a peregrine, and flew away. And thus the Fijians were never conquered. The island group next to Fiji, called Vanuatu, the old New Hebrides Islands, has about 100 languages on them. The people there live in little sort of colonial groups. There's no word for peregrine there. And so the work in those two countries for me and my colleague were extremely different and very difficult in Vanuatu because you really couldn't communicate with them. They speak, in order to have a united language, they speak a pidgin English. It's called Bishlama. It's a language that is sort of descriptive. And so instead of saying Prince Charles, they'll say #1 Pickaninny Blong Queen. In other words, the first child that belongs to the queen. And it's a very descriptive, long, drawn-out sort of a thing, this pidgin English, and it makes it difficult to try to deal with people on Vanuatu. But let's take a look now at what we're talking about. In Greenland, we would get there by military aircraft out of Maryland and go to Sandestrom Fjord, a military air base. Peregrines in Greenland nest right up by the ice cap. If you've never seen the ice cap, it's a marvelous thing to see. This ice cap, along with Antarctica, ties up about 96 to 98% of all the fresh water on the planet. So that any stream and lake and river you can think of only make up 2 or 3% of all the fresh water on this planet. And peregrines nest not too far from them. There's the ice cap back there again, and peregrines will nest quite close to them. Up at Thule, what happened is the B-52 bomber landed on this area right here during a winter when it was frozen over. Crash landed there. The crew, I think, got away. But anyway, it sunk to the ground, and back in here is where the town of Thule was, and seabirds would fly out and feed over that portion of the water. They would have to dive quite deeply. At least we thought the seabirds did. And so the question was, are they in fact picking up radioactive material and carrying it into South America, where they then can, if they're shot or if they're handled or whatever, pass that on. So a study was started up there. Wonderful place to work, because here's a picture of midnight in a place called Paradise Valley. It's wonderful to sleep in your sleeping bag, fish that night on the ocean-run Arctic char, and listen to the muskoxen ruminate not too far from you as you lay and contemplate what you can do the next day. It's a wonderful, wonderful place. If you've never been to that part of the unknown world, I invite you to go. And so one of the things that was done was to put on these red alphanumeric bands on young peregrines. Now I show you this A36 because it had an interesting history. It was trapped, it was banded in July, I forget the year, but it was trapped again as it migrated south, trapped on the east coast of North America around Chincoteague Island, and was finally killed in South America in November. So we know something about that individual. Here are 3 young ready to go with their alphanumeric bands. Or we would trap the adults. Here's what they look like when they're trapped in a hand. You can see that more or less the size of them. If I had a living one with me, I would have brought it, but I've sent them all down to California. And then we would attach on the back of them these satellite transmitters. Now, these are a very interesting thing. They cost $3,000 a piece to do this, so it's not something you want to do just as a vacation exercise. But they are accurate enough that if you get 3 Argus satellites that can home in on those satellites, you can find out where that bird is within 10 meters of where it is. So you can follow it from where you put that on all the way down to where it goes and all the way back. And they will last, if you have the cycle, so that every 3 days it turns on, you get a 3-day reading of them. And one of my colleagues was called, he lived in Seattle. They called him and said, Bud, we've got a bird down in Argentina that's transmitter's going bad. Would you go trap it? Here are the coordinates of it. Here's the GPS coordinates of it. So he got on the airplane in Seattle, flew to Buenos Aires, rented a car, drove up to where the GPS coordinates was and put his binoculars up, and there in the middle of the lake on a tree was this peregrine falcon. He couldn't trap it. So, it kind of was a dead-end trip, but at least that tells you what sort of information you can gain from them. And right now I have graduate students doing this in Utah with goshawks. And this is something, this is an old map, and so you'll just have to forgive me, but this gives you an idea of these Arctic birds from here moving down to here, an 11,000 kilometer trip in 1 year. Now in South America, when they get down there, that's a different place to try to work, but one of the things that removes this sort of wilderness aura that people have created about peregrine falcons is to see them in cities. Here's one on right here sitting on a building in Porto Alegre. Here's the busy beach, and down here is the boulevard. If you can think of Rio de Janeiro, you know how these big, colorful boulevards are. And at night when the bats come out, you see them flying around these streetlights trying to get bats. It changes your entire perspective of what peregrines are. There's another one sitting right there on a water cooler. Well, let's go to the Aleutian Islands, because this is another interesting part of the parts unknown. The Aleutian Islands, as you know, there were only two places in North America that during World War II enemy held American land. That was in the Aleutians, the island of Kiska and the island of Vanuatu, and so there's a lot of sort of memorabilia out there. This is what the peregrines look like there. They're quite different than they are elsewhere, and they nest on cliffs that are along the seacoast. There's the adult up there. The nest site is right here where this climber is. Gives you an idea of sort of where they nest, and here's one with one of my graduate students. You can see what that particular bird looks like. And here's what a normal clutch of eggs should look like. Now, these bones that you see around there are not things that the peregrine have placed there voluntarily, but they get very sort of, I'm going to use the human term, bored, sitting on those eggs, and so they began to pull bones around them. These are all leg bones and wing bones of their prey items, but they form a nice sort of substratum for them to lay those eggs on. Well, here's what we did. We had to look at peregrine falcons to find out what their prey species were in case one of these underground tests began to vent or begin to leak activity. Here's the last one, Canakin. They would come in, drill a hole here down 6,000 feet in the ground, put in a 5 megaton nuclear device and shoot it off. When they did, the ground at ground zero rose 18 feet in the air and settled back down about 12 feet, so that it left about 4 to 5 feet of tundra fluff. And we were supposed to try to look and see what the effect was on them, what the effect was on other bird species that might be there, and did it have any sort of negative effect. Well, here's where a peregrine nest was. This is right opposite ground zero before the detonation, and here's what it looks like after the detonation. And so part of the problem, you see, was trying to find what sort of impact do these activities have on the wildlife. So now let's leave the Aleutian Islands and go to the Arctic and look at them. Peregrines there. You can see how different this peregrine looks. A very pale bird with a nice little white thing on the back of its head. And they would set us down on helicopters on these rivers, and the idea was to, with funding from the National Science Foundation, would be to traverse these rivers and find out what the populations were, what the prey base was, and what the carrying capacity of the landscape might be. This river is the Canning River, which forms the western boundary of the Arctic Wildlife Range. And here's another one of the Canning River. Very difficult rivers to work, very shallow. You can see on this boat we had to put canvas on the bottom here because the rocks would tear it apart as we moved down through it. And there is another one of those rivers, and here's one of my colleagues standing here, and the nest site is right there with those eggs. And here's what that nest site looked like in July. Because of the pesticide problem, two things happen. The chlorinated hydrocarbons would tie up carbonic anhydrase so that that was not available to make calcium to put on shells, and so the shells would break. And there's one that looks like an 18-wheeler has run over it. I'm sorry for how bleached out this slide is, but that's the best one I can find of it. And the second thing that happens is these pesticides would hydroxylate steroid hormones. They would cause the hormones to throw off hydrogens. And so the bird would not recognize its steroid hormones. Now, these are the hormones that you use that drive young males and young females to hold hands, to nibble on necks, to nibble on earlobes or whatever, and drives you into marriage. These are the sex hormones. And when those are excreted, the female does not recognize her young, and so here are two babies which she had deserted. She was sitting on the bluff about 100 feet away during a snowstorm in this July and allowed her young to die. Well, that was what was happening up there on that river. So the other thing we're asked to do is look at them along this river right here. Now, this won't mean much to you, but I'm going to read something right there for you. This is called the Saguenay-Urtalk River. Right up here is where Prudhoe Bay is, the oil strike in Alaska. Because the species was endangered, there had to be limitations of what people could do around them. Now, what you see here, if that can be focused any a little bit, can you focus just a bit? Here's a silhouette, there's a couple of silhouettes, there's a silhouette, here's a silhouette, and there's one. These are peregrine falcon nesting locations. What Fish and Wildlife asked us to do, us me and a colleague to do, was to come up with some recommendations on what they should do and what they could do. We wrote a recommendation that is listed on this aerial map. I'm sure this now may be a collector's item because these maps are no longer, those have all been gone a long time ago. But what that says there is nesting area for endangered species. Avoid critical habitat area of peregrine falcons. Recommended en route flights, operate above 1,500 feet and at least 1 mile from nesting areas, but only during the period April 15 through August 31. Planned departure/arrival paths to avoid critical areas around the Saguenay Airport. Today, if you go on that river, there are 30 pair, and there are seven silhouettes that you can see there. Our recommendations were way too high. They should have been reduced quite a bit, but that only comes with a bit more knowledge. Well, let's go to the Southern Hemisphere now and take a look at him and look at peregrines in another parts unknown of places that people seldom get, or at least to look at peregrines. And we're going to look at a place in Australia right there, Fiji right there, and Vanuatu right there. So here's Australia. They may have, for the species, the widest range of nesting substratum of any peregrine population there is. They will nest in stick nests in trees. This is a cormorant nest. There's an old cormorant. Cormorant's a fish-eating bird, for those who may not know. And this is in a swamp where these cormorants live. There's a cormorant nest, there's a cormorant nest, and there's a young peregrine falcon right there. Or they will nest on cliffs and on quarries. Here's a quarry that's being worked. They're dumping rocks out every day there. The nest site is right in here. There's a couple of my graduate students going down to get there. Or they will nest in tree sites. There are the eggs right there, and there's the adult coming into these tree sites. Now, what makes this of interest, at least biologically of interest, is that if you look at the eggs in tree hollow nesting birds, peregrines, they are statistically larger than they are in other populations. So that tells us that this probably is a single population that young are raised in tree hollows and returned to tree hollows. So here we have a genetic type, if you will, that probably is not going to survive because these old trees are being cut down about as fast as the farmer can clear the landscape. But that's an interesting aspect of the biology of peregrines. And here's here's a pair of adults. We would trap them, put color bands on them to find out how much movement there was between trees and cliffs and stick nests or whatever. These were cliff nesters. The smaller male here and the larger female there. And there are some young ones in one of these tree hollow nests. So the problem, you see, in Australia is quite different than elsewhere. The problem in Victoria is that there are at least 3 different populations, if you will, that are breeding, and the habitat in those populations is receiving different kinds of impact. Well, let's go to Fiji. In Fiji, we used helicopters and covered at least the larger 2 islands of Itilevu and Vanuatu, I can't give it, that island is over there. We didn't get out into the Lau group at all, but we covered most of these islands, and we found that the population was very sparse. This is of interest to us biologically, because we would, as we interviewed Fijians and asked them, do you know Vanuatu, do you know where they are? She'd say, well, yeah, there's some nesting on this cliff right behind you, or no, they're not there. And so then we found that one of the really important places for them was in a little village of Namosi. And for anybody who travels to Fiji, next time you go, I recommend you rent a car and you drive to Namosi and you talk to the people there. This cliff right up here and that ledge, I'm going to show you that again. We were able to put a helicopter right into that ledge to find the young, to show you how large that cliff is. This thing is probably 4,000 feet in elevation. And this is the one that led to the legends, in part, of the chieftain that climbed up into the cliff, turned into a Vanuatu, and flew away. And therefore, the Fijians were really never conquered. When you talk to them today, they still have these legends. This folklore is still very rich in their lives. But most people in Fiji have never seen Vanuatu. Although they know about it, they haven't seen it. Here's my colleague in that cave. The nest site is right behind this little clump there. He's looking at it right there. The helicopter flew in, put its skids right here while he climbed out and got in. The cave is high enough that the rotor blade wouldn't hit anything. When he brought out the food remains. You can see what they are. Primarily flying fox fruit bats, bats that have a wingspread about like this. If you see the movie Bridge on the River Kwai, about midway through it, there's a gunshot and the forest explodes. There's all of these bats that are flying. That's these big flying fox fruit bats. Well, we took some young from there to see, to try to look at their biology in captivity from several of the Iries. And here's what they look like. They're different, you see than those that we saw from the Aleutians. And we're now trying to breed them in Fiji itself, because we have noticed that in the past 20 years of our work there, where we started with 15 or 18 Iries, we now have 2 or 3 left. Something's happened. We don't know what it is. We're not quite sure. It may be that we don't understand tropical bird biology well, and it may simply be a cyclic phenomenon. But this was built for us. Inside we have televisions. There was a peregrine right there sitting on a nest ledge. There's an empty nest ledge. And so we can monitor all of these as we look at them. And here's the outside facility, and this is what it says on there. This facility is dedicated to Dr. Clayton White, Department of Zoology, Brigham Young University, Provo, USA, and Dr. Daniel Brim, Endangered Species Recovery Council, San Diego, California. And it's a direct result of more than 15 years of research they have devoted to the Fiji peregrine falcon. Funding for this building was provided by the Endangered Species Recovery Council and by the Kula Eco Park under the Memorandum of Understanding with the National Trust for Fiji. Official opening by Tuara Tagavuta, the Honorable Ratu Joseph Emilo, and then he's got a bunch of things behind his name. I don't know what they mean. MF, MBE, JP, JF, President of the Senate of Fiji and Chairman of the Council of the National Trust for Fiji, October 1989. And so we're trying to find out what's going on with these falcons. And part of what we're finding, there's a pair of them, the male over here and the female there. Part of what's happening is they are very, very highly inbred. These are DNA fingerprints of them. You can see here on Fiji, these are 6 different individuals. There's not 1 cent worth of difference between them. When we had those fingerprints done, the technician said to me, Dr. White, you're trying to fool me. You took a sample of a peregrine and put it in 6 vials. And I said, no, I took 6 samples and put it in 6 vials. These are birds from 4 different islands in Fiji. And you can see how different they are from those from Argentina or from Alaska in terms of those banding that are critical. If you look at it at a different level, here you can see it once again. Those from Fiji are highly inbred. Well, in biology, there is the notion that inbreeding is bad. And of course, we say that in humans because culturally, we think it's bad for brothers to marry sisters or sons to marry mothers or whatever. But the rationale for that probably is because we are a species that has evolved outbreeding. And we accumulate heavy loads of heavy genetic load. And all we do is magnify that load. On islands, there has to be inbreeding. And so what we think has happened on islands, we think there is the evolution of inbreeding because a certain number can get there, and that's it. And only 3 things can take place. Either the genetic load is so high that they go extinct and they no longer occur there, or they pass through what we call a bottleneck and reduce that genetic load, and then they begin to inbreed, or they get genetic material from outside sources. Well, the DNA tells us there is no outside sources here. So now we're looking at an interesting phenomenon called inbreeding and inbreeding depression, and I think much of what we teach you in college is probably going to prove to be wrong, but we'll teach you anyway. Let's go to Vanuatu now. Here's a typical native of Vanuatu. Here's the sort of thing that the people of those islands love. It's called yankona. It's a pepper plant, and from that they mash it up and make a drink that they can use in their ceremonies and in the things that they do. It tastes, well, if you've ever seen a heavy rainstorm in a barnyard and the stuff that kind of runs off to the side, it tastes like that sort of. It numbs your tongue. But they get tanked up on this stuff, and whenever you go to one of the islands and you have to find out who owns that island, because the person that owns that island owns the cliff, and therefore he owns the Peregrines. So the first thing you do is you come in, land the helicopter down, and go up to him and present him with the kava root. You go through a little ceremony, and they break it up, and then you sit around and you sort of sip this kava root for an hour and a half or 2 hours or 3 hours until your tongue gets really numb, and then you ask for permission. Can I go on your cliff and look at your falcons? And he says, yes, you can. And here are the islands that we've covered. They start up here, and it won't mean much to you. We haven't done all of them, but from what we have done, we've now found that the population mirrors that of Fiji, as we would have predicted. Vanuatu is known for three things. It's known for the active volcanoes that are the most accessible in the world. You can take a jeep and drive to the base of this volcano right over here, and walk up to it in 10 minutes. It's known for what's called the $1 Million Point, where following World War II they dumped all of the material they had in there, and they used that as a jump-off place to invade the Solomon Islands. And it's also known for their bungee jumping, which we'll talk about a bit later. Here's the inside of the volcano. You stand on the rim and look at those, and believe me, it is mesmerizing. My wife had to be dragged away from that place. Well, once again, they feed on bats. Here's the flying fox fruit bat. A big camp of them here. A helicopter scared them up, and you can see them sort of circling around. A very easy target for peregrines. Here's a nest, a cliff which they nest on. For you have some perspective, this tree here is 150 feet tall. So that cliff's about 200 and something. Here's what the young look like in the nest site. And then when you trap them, here's what they look like. And I asked one of the Fijians, trying to get the language sorted out, what he called this bird. And he says, oh, yeah, that's Kalayella. And I said, Kalayella? And it took me a minute to think about it. And I thought, oh, yeah, he's saying yellow color in Bishlama. And he was looking at the yellow here, and I'll show you this thing again. And that was his name. And I went to the next village and showed them the picture and asked him what it was. And he said, oh, that's Nasigo, which means he goes to the sea. And what he was talking about, he was describing this thing that flew from the cliff out to sea to do whatever they do and hunt. And so we had a really difficult time in communicating with people and finding out much about the biology of peregrines, only because these lovely people do not have a language that is the same. Well, anyway, we then trapped it. There's my wife with me, and then we take blood samples from them. Everybody gets in. Here is a ranch we trapped on, not the ranch, here's the owners of the ranch we trapped on, a couple of LDS couple that live over there and run a ranch. And at the end, you can see why he would call it Kalayella. If that light can be put out, you can see how yellow these colors are on it. And this is perhaps the most spectacular, in my mind, of all of the peregrines from the parts unknown, are these things in Fiji and in Vanuatu. Well, that's sort of the story of peregrine falcons, a brief resume, a brief, quick glance through them from the Arctic to the tropics. And I really have nothing else to say. If there's some questions, we can turn to them if you turn the lights back on. We've got about 10 minutes, I think, or 5 minutes.
Just curious, in the north slope of the Brooks Range, where were the pesticides you detected in the falcons coming from? Any idea?
Yeah. We think probably they were picking them up in one of two places. The prey items which they feed on migrate. Many of them winter on the east coast of the United States, along the Gulf Coast, and down as far as South America. Pesticide usage in South America during the 70s was extremely high. And in fact, when I was in Argentina in about 1976, I asked an Argentine guy there who owned a big estancia if he was aware of the pesticide problem. And this chap had lived with the editor of the San Francisco Chronicle, and he was aware of it. He said, yeah. And I said, well, what do you use on your crops? He said, well, got kind of a sly grin. He said, well, we use DDT. And I said, why? He said, because I got to make money. It's a very cheap pesticide, and so that's what they were using. But it would come from at least 2 sources and perhaps 3 sources. One might have been a local source because the military came in and had at least 2 different military bases there. And as recently as a year ago, a 55-gallon drum of DDT was found. Still hadn't been used. So they sprayed for mosquitoes locally. That could have done it. Or the prey species on which they lived migrated down and picked it up, and or the falcon was going into South America where it was getting. So at least 3 sources. Okay. The population on the North Slope declined about 70 to 75%, almost 80% decline.
Dr. White, I have a question. Obviously, the tundra peregrine on the North Slope was affected 80%. Were the Fijian peregrines and other populations of peregrines affected? Apparently some of them were. Some of them may not have been from DDT. Were there some populations that weren't affected at all from DDT?
Yeah, that's a very good question, because there's sort of a misunderstanding when the peregrine is put on the endangered list, and they talked about DDT. That was called endangered worldwide, and that wasn't true at all. In fact, those on the Pacific Northwest of the United States were never put on the list. We don't know what happened in South America. They're not good data. We know in Africa not much happened. We know in Australia, Victoria, the state of Victoria, the eggshells declined about 12%. They didn't in northern Australia. They didn't throughout much of Indonesia, so far as we know. They were mainly affected in North America and Western Europe, the industrialized countries. They were pretty severely affected in the Soviet Union, but there are no data from the Soviet Union. They were not affected at all in the Pacific Islands or in the Philippines, for example, or places like New Guinea. They were never affected. And so that's a misconception that a lot of people have.
One other question that relates to it. In the 70s, breeding projects were set up to reintroduce the peregrine. And what populations did these peregrines come from that were reintroduced, and how much, for lack of a better word, bastardization of the wild population was accomplished through this release program?
Good question. What he's talking about, by the way, this is the coach of the women's cross-country team that has such a great team if you don't know him. Marvelous guy. He's really put BYU on the map. What he's talking about is the fact that in eastern United States and Canada, the bird went extinct. And in western United States, it declined by about 60 to 70%. So in the eastern United States, they reintroduced them. They bred them in captivity, and they got stocks from wherever they could get them. They got them from Scotland. They got them from Argentina. Let's see if I remember. They got them from Scotland. They got them from Argentina. They got them from Spain. They got them from the Pacific Northwest, from the Aleutians, from Arctic Alaska, a couple other places. And just bred them willy-nilly to get what they could get. And so when they would put them out, these things were really mixed up in terms of their genetic parentage. And his question is, what kind of consequences will that have? And the answer to that is probably very, very little. It's like saying, I was born in Wyoming, and I'm Caucasian, and I happen to marry a Navajo lady. Will it affect my children? Well, probably not. And so I have, my children then are half Wyomingite and half Navajo. And so when they marry, if they marry a Wyomingite, their children are now only a quarter Navajo. And when their children marry, they then are an eighth Navajo. And so these things sort themselves out very quickly. They were mixed up. They're mixed. In fact, this would make a wonderful PhD dissertation for someone to document how long it takes to sort out these genes. And it turned out that all of them that they turned loose, some had better success than others. Some were very poor breeding in the eastern United States. But there were at least 7 different gene pools that were mixed up and turned loose. And that in itself is an interesting sort of biological question that should be followed and is being followed, I believe. So probably nothing. They're just too similar. In fact, we can't tell the difference if we use cytochrome B to look at them. we have to lump them all. See, there's a question about where the species limits are between 2 or 3 that look alike, and you can't sort that out by cytochrome B, by genetics. You can't sort that out. So they're that closely related genetically. They're very conservative genetically. They probably had their origin in the Pleistocene. They're only 1 million years old as a species. The fossil record doesn't go back beyond that. There's very little genetic differences between them. So it's probably nothing. It turns out to be more of an ethical, more of an esoteric question. People's feeling, a fuzzy, warm, fuzzy feeling question than a biological question, really, in my estimation.
If the lack of genetic variation among the subpopulations in the Fijian groups, if that indicates that there's not a lot of mixing going on in those subpopulations, why would you speculate that that is, given the information of the many other types that are capable of such long migrations, like from Greenland to South America?
Good question. Probably because of this phylopatry. It doesn't matter how far a bird flies, it only matters where it settles to breed. And so if you go to Greenland and band them, most young that are banded at a site, most males will breed within 20 kilometers of where it was born and raised, and most females within 40 kilometers of where it was born and raised. So it doesn't really matter how far they migrate. Fiji, however, is off the beaten path. We think they may have gotten there across the land bridge during the Pleistocene, and there are no peregrines that sort of move in there. There's nothing that migrates down to Fiji. There are no other peregrines that get there. They have to be either wind-blown from adjacent islands or transported by humans, basically. So there's no input, there's no new genetic input from this original group. And then you have to also recognize that it depends on how many got there. I don't know what the genetics of people in Hawaii are, and I don't know what the population size of the Polynesians that got there, but I don't imagine it's very large. And unless you have continual input, you only have what you have to work with. And we suspect that only a very few pairs were there to start with, and they only had that genetic variability at that time. So that's why they're the way they are. And we're sure there are other populations like that. The Falkland Islands are probably like that. And in fact, we think some of the Aleutian Islands are, because they just don't move. And if they do, they come back to breed right where they were born. As an indication of this, if you go around Great Salt Lake, we reintroduced birds on Great Salt Lake by building some tall towers. They used to breed on the cliffs. There were about 21 Iris nesting sites that we knew about between Brigham City and Provo, the southmost one down overlooking the Springville fish hatchery. To reintroduce them, the Fish and Game built towers, artificial towers around Great Salt Lake. Today, they fight over those towers. They're nesting on raven nests on the power lines that go past those towers, and they haven't yet invaded the cliffs. They haven't even moved back on the cliffs yet, and it's been nearly 20 years since they began the reintroduction process. There's nothing to cause them to go back to the cliffs. There's no genetic program. There's nothing that tells them, you belong on a cliff. You don't belong on this tower, you see. So that sort of gives you a view of maybe the way peregrines look at it. I don't know if that answers your question or not, but they're really homebodies. They really are.
That brings me to another question of what do you foresee for the future of peregrines? Like, given the success of the reintroduction programs and stuff, like, is there overall distribution generally still gaining, or is it,
oh yes,
or is it?
Oh yes.
And is it reaching the levels that it once was?
It has exceeded what we thought was the original numbers. The United Kingdom prior to World War II had about 980 to 1,000 pair. There are now nearly 2,000 pair. There are 1,800 pair. Spain, I'm sorry, think another country quickly, Italy, they have gone up. France, there's something like 1,300 pair now in France. And what we've seen happen is they are shooting up above what we thought was the original carrying capacity. Now, that might be that the carrying capacity has changed. See, it's been 5 decades. And if you look at the human population growth during those decades, ask yourself, how much landscape change has there been? And has that landscape change been good? And for peregrines, it has been wonderful. Post-World War II, the British got a lot more money. A lot of people in the British Isles went into pigeon raising. Peregrines love pigeons, so the pigeon raisers feed peregrines, and peregrines just are going crazy. They're wall to wall. We put in the Glen Canyon. Prior to 1942, there were no known nest sites in Grand Canyon. Glen Canyon Dam went in, the water, and the hypothesis is this. Now, I don't know if that's right, but it's a working hypothesis. The water that comes out now below Glen Canyon is very cold and clear. Aquatic insect numbers have quadrupled. All you have to do is stand on the bank and you'll see lizards, whiptails moving around all over the place. This has increased swallow populations and bat populations. And now there are about 100 pair of peregrines living in the Grand Canyon, which prior to that time, they were not known to even breed there. So a lot of it has been habitat alterations that have benefited them. And a lot of what we're seeing now is probably just this surge of a new genetic revolution, if you will, of pairs coming back. But they're everywhere. They're just everywhere. Everywhere. And it's fun for me, you know.
Okay, I have a question. I've heard people talk about a subspecies of peregrine in the Appalachians that was wiped out called the rock peregrine. And I was just wondering if you've ever heard of that and what your opinion is on them. I'm not sure if I've ever read anything scientific on them.
Well, what it was, it's in North America, if you look east to west, the peregrines in the Appalachians from the New England states down about to Georgia, they were resident there. They didn't go anywhere. And so the selection on them, you have a very humid environment that's very cold in the winter, very warm in the summer, and they stayed right there. And so that's selected for a certain kind of a bird. And they were a rather dark, big bird. When you moved to western United States, they were smaller and redder in color. And so all you were looking at are population differences between those that were resident in the east and those in the west, many of which migrated into Mexico, and a much smaller bird. And yes, those birds in the east did disappear. They were called the rock peregrine. And just out of interest, you might find of interest, the first settlers that got here in the Jamestown colony, two of the people that came over in the 1400s were falconers from England. And they trapped peregrines on the coast of the East Coast. And they called them lannerets. They called them a bird that occurs in Europe. It's a small bird, of a lanner falcon, and these looked like them. And what they were trapping were Arctic migrants. And they distinguished those Arctic migrants from the local birds, which they called something else. I don't remember the name they called those. But they distinguished these two types very, very easily. And it wasn't until many years later that science began to take note of what happened. But these early falconers from the Jamestown colony, Captain James Cook was a falconer himself, and he writes on this in a book called American History. So, or a History of America or something like that. So they were quite a unique-looking bird. And what will be fun to see is if this new reintroduced population is under the same selection pressures and takes on the same morphology. I'm going to live for 20 more years. I'm trying to negotiate 25, but I'm going to live 20 anyway. And I want to hope to follow that through and see if there's enough generations for selection to start producing them. I have a photograph of one that I took on the Cornell Medical School in downtown New York, and it looks just like the early birds that were there in the 30s and the 40s. Looks just like one. I could pass it off for one, and no one would know the difference.